your time. We love it, so that we can have a bit of a conversation with our speakers. Do you guys want to come out the front so that we can kind of see you all? And maybe if we have 10 or 15 minutes, if people still have the time to stick around, and I invite you to ask questions. I'm going to turn the lights on so that we can see each other. In order to do that, there's a microphone. Maybe we can speak loudly. Maybe we can speak loudly. Okay. All right. I just wanted to open with just a little comment, which is about, why this research? Where does it fit in? And I guess, our speakers have already kind of covered it off, but basically it's an attempt to benchmark is what, the motive is, to kind of say, let's just go back a little bit and, kind of assess and get a context here in order to really kind of fully grasp what's going on. Because as Agnieszka showed, all the polling, it's all coming all the time, and it's apparently telling us one thing and another. And I think that this kind of research, which is, kind of looking back as well as forward, is about benchmarking, saying this is where we are, this is where we've been, this is where we are now. And, the hope is that with interventions, with increased exchange, with increased language learning, we might see a change. So it's about making arguments also to the powers that be to show them that there can be an impact if these kinds of interventions happen. So that's kind of what it's about. Can I open up for questions? Who would like to start? David Mitchell?
Yes, I have a question for you, Agnieszka. I love getting to know you, and I like to listen to your research, but I was a bit suspicious you were putting your...
Can't hear very well.
Oh.
There's a microphone here.
Oh, okay, no, that's very good.
Now, ask you a question, David, because we don't have hours. Yeah.
Look, I thought you might have been pulling your punches. I like the way you related Australia's perception of threat to a basic Australian insecurity. But there must be another variable. Australians perceive their leaders, their opinion leaders in the press, their political leaders, are very actively expressing hostility, criticism, aggressiveness towards Indonesia. And from that, they deduce that Indonesia must be a threat. So I think, did you consider that as a possibility?
Thank you for the question. Yes, of course it's much more complex than what the polls capture. And I think that is basically, if there's one takeaway for you to take from this presentation and from the research, is that attitudes are much more complex than what the polling even begins to question, let alone the answers that it gives us. We know not to trust polling, so to a lot of you this is just, me hammering on something we already know. But perhaps showing all the different ways in which polling doesn't capture things is one of those. And as you say, there is more to it than just, raw Australian insecurity. Of course, there are things going on in the media. There are things going on in cultural productions, so books, films, sort of all the different ways in which opinions are formed. That is all part of it. Luckily, though, my brief was to look at polling, and so that was the one way to contain it. But I agree, I think that it needs something much bigger than this. I did this to dip a toe in to show that actually what this needs is proper, sustained, long-term historical and social science, sociological, anthropological analysis, not perhaps the sort of 10-second grab that we get after a poll is conducted.
How is nodding along?
I think that David's point is valid, but at the same time, these were some of the questions that we asked in the few focus groups that we did conduct, and people were adamant that actually the national leaders didn't matter that much. If there was anybody that was leading the discussion, if there was anybody who was leading necessarily a negative view of Australia or Indonesia, it was more local. For instance, in Indonesia, predominantly what got flagged was local religious leaders. sometimes people believed were problematic. Older people held more conservative views, and also people presented the local kampong and whoever was leading the kampong as leading views. They were quite adamant that at the national level it didn't really matter that much, and they didn't actually put much stock in what was happening at the national level. Now, I should also add, of course, that what happens at the national level does trickle down.
Another question? Sure. And then
Yeah. I wanted to know if this is directed towards the panel, if from your research you were able to see any difference between the attitudes towards the bilateral relationship between, say, Gen Y, Gen Z, and compared to the older generations.
Great question. We didn't specifically compare people from different ages in our first analyse, but we did get, there was certainly a lot of talk about how these attitudes change with age, and there was certainly a lot of reference that, that with the younger generation that, are more connected to social media, who've travelled more, perhaps differences in education and so forth, all of those things, and interactions, people studying abroad, all those things all have an influence on our attitudes, and there was this strong sense that attitudes were changing, people knew more about each other.
can you say something then about social media and how, if you were to extend the Luke study, how important that might be? I think that's in your report.
Yeah. One of the things that we'd like to do in the future with Luke is to not just look at the newspapers, but to look at the commentary afterwards, because that really gives you an idea of what the people think, and also how they're responding to those articles that are written. But that, what the next step, I guess, we're suggesting for future research is to extend the dictionary, because we need to extend the dictionary in order to capture the language that's used on those commentary sites and things like that. But it can certainly be used to, this is just a snapshot of what the tool can do. And if the dictionary is growing, it can do far more. It can analyse all kinds of textual data, and so the scope for it is big.
So I'd imagine that if you were trying to target things like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and the usual jazz, you'd probably have to create an entirely separate dictionary specifically targeted at Indonesian and Australian slang.
Pass it to the linguist.
Not a separate dictionary necessarily, but you would add more words to the dictionary. When I was giving the numbers of what Luke captures with regard to the Indonesian context, what it's capturing is standard language. So if you were to truly, if you're aware of the Indonesian language and the nuances of the Indonesian language, and also the nuances of how a lot of ethnic terms, especially if you're looking at Java, Bandung, and Central and East Java slip in, ideally if you were looking for a tool that would capture all of that, you would need a much larger dictionary, because if you don't have a larger dictionary, it begins to lose its explanatory power. Yeah.
Richard,
My question is about West New Guinea. I think you produced some wonderfully fascinating data. And I take your point about the political constructions of both the questions and the media reporting of the survey results. And I would have thought that what the government was saying, particularly in the early years of that dispute, so we're talking about in the early 1950s, was certainly not asserting that Australia wanted to take over. So, that option was in the polling. It was getting quite close to it. It was asserting that West New Guinea was a region of key strategic national interest. And so the rhetoric was getting, the government's own rhetoric was getting quite close. It's an interesting period in as much as opposed to the period of the revolution, where those attitudes that you betrayed were in contrast to the Labour government support movement. In the 1950s and early 60s, until 62, the Menzies government was a firm supporter of continued Dutch control anti-notionally Papua self-determination. So, and from time to time actively cultivating suspicion about Indonesia's expansionism. And so it's quite a different context, post of the revolution period and the entire period where, from, I suppose, particularly from coup on, where governments have been saying, mostly in public, there is no threat. And yet we have quite high levels of perceived threat in public opinion.
Yes, absolutely, and I wouldn't want to play down any of that. I mean, this was an incredibly complex period when governments were presenting new narrative, national governments were presenting new stories based on domestic politics and based on domestic audiences and how they were going to consume that, as well as the sort of sheer politics of it. And the interesting thing about the West New Guinea, of course, is that it brings together in such perfect ways the sort of broader historical shifts of decolonisation and the Cold War, and what Australia, the lesson that it learned from the war, which is that New Guinea is incredibly important to keep out any sort of Asian invasion. So actually you have, so many points that are coming together in that West New Guinea debate. This doesn't begin to scrape the surface, of course, and I think that's sort of part of the point, that we assume that it does capture knowledge that's important without sort of more broadly asking where it's come from, where it's created. What I didn't go into at all through limitations of time is the idea that Australian constructions of Indonesia are often conflated with broader categories, in the same way perhaps that Australians are seen as just Westerners. Indonesians exist in Australian mindsets, or at least they did historically. I'm not as confident talking about today, but as either Southeast Asians, colonised people, the third world, the underdeveloped world, all these different categories which people sort of use to simplify their understandings of the world, all sort of have purchase, and they push against and jostle against each other. So even specific knowledge about a specific political context, like what you're talking about with West New Guinea, is fighting with much broader categories to create perceptions. I mean, this is why attitudes and perceptions are so difficult to get at, because they are so complex. But yes, there is a lot more going on at a political level than any of the suggested.
Indeed. What are the drivers? You need to have all that context, and that's why analysis like this, it's dipping a toe, but in fact it does aid that, the work of the historian and political scientist. I think it's really complementary as well. So another question? Yes? Aldrin?
I'm just really interested about because we come here to hear about attitude, so it's like the first thing in my mind that what I'm trying to find here is like whether Australia knows Indonesia better, and as well whether Indonesia really knows about Australia. Because I'm really interested about the politics of identity. Like sometimes we're still for information. Like people just know about Bali. Like every time we talk to people, it's like, hey, just Bali. But it's like a lot of things like in Indonesia that we really don't even know. And it's like, I even know Australia because a Guy Sebastian won I really want to know about Australia when Guy Sebastian won Australian Idol 2001, and then it's the first time I want to know about Australia. So that's what I want to know, because I'm working so hard to promote better understanding about Australia and Indonesia, but I saw a lack of word understanding that. Because I think that's the key. So I want to give a recommendation. Maybe there's I'm sorry.
So your question is how much do Australians and Indonesians actually?
Yeah, so it's and how's the...
So asking the opinion, the whole of how you feel, but what is this based upon?
Thank you, Jemima.
Is there something that you can comment on?
Not much. is the answer. I mean, but intuitively, and you would know from your experience living here and also Indonesia, that what we constantly encountered was, as Rose alluded to, that people generally conflate categories on both sides. But what people did present to us that we thought was quite interesting, especially out of Indonesia, was people felt like they didn't have adequate access to cultural objects, but not cultural objects that were necessarily contrived. And what I mean is people people are interested in what they're interested in, and the general attitude was that both sides still hadn't really articulated well enough why the other side should care when they weren't in times of crisis. And the thing that I'll add, and it sounds like you guys have something to say, and that'd be appreciated because you'll have this kind of information, but people felt like if cultural objects were available, when at one of the universities I went to, the people were well aware of Australia because they had Australian books sitting around, and they read the books and they were interested in those books. At another place, they were aware of Australians because they had Australian visitors at the university, and that had a follow-on effect because whenever there were times of crisis, the kids would go home and talk to their families, and they would explain Australia to their families. So I mean, if there were one message to send, two messages to send away from that: firstly, cultural objects, access to cultural objects that are meaningful to the other side is very important. Eka Kurnia one is a win there, but also things like the New Colombo plan work, even though we don't see them because people go home and they go home with a positive view of the relationship. But sorry, I didn't mean to keep talking with you.
I just wanted to build upon what you were saying. And certainly from my experience being a Gen Y, the obvious. If you want an example of a culture or a language that has successfully infiltrated, so to speak, into my generation, you look at Japan. Japan long past the point where Japan was an economic power, long past the point it's been a cultural power. It's been a cultural power that's permeated Western society. Since I was a kid, my generation has been influcted with Japanese video games, with Japanese animation, with Japanese movies. So long past the point where Japan where there's almost virtually. It makes more economic sense to do business with Indonesia at the moment than it does with Japan. But still, more kids are learning Japanese. Why? Because it's relevant to their lives. Whereas, what examples of Indonesian culture do you see amongst my generation, amongst the next generation? There's virtually none. And I'm sorry to say, unless it can be produced on mass and permeate and saturate our generation, we're not going to care.
Correct. That's exactly right. Thank you very much. That's well said, because I think exactly what you're saying on the Indonesian side too. There's nothing to fill a void. That's why there is this ignorance, because what do you put in that place? We might just have time for one or two questions. There's one at the front and one at the back. Yes, please.
Just to quickly add on to his point, whenever I say that I'm studying Indonesian, most people don't actually recognise how close geographically Indonesia is to Australia, which I find very interesting, and they sort of see it as an impoverished country, which leads me on to my next point. When Indonesia does inevitably overtake Australia in terms of GDP, and just generally, do you think that the politicians will start to sort of attack it, and do you think that the sort of threat level will go up in the polls?
Attack it?
Start to see it as more of a threat, and then people start to perhaps become a little bit more cautious of how they approach it.
Firing a cautious rhetoric.
Yes, fire rhetoric.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've got an honours student who's looking at how that sort of increasing sort of trade complementarity is something that the Australian government is really struggling to get their heads around. This idea that Indonesia is a place that receives Australian aid is very firmly entrenched still at very high levels of government, whereas in fact, as you say, things are changing very fast. It is a fast change though. 2010 Australian aid post-tsunami was still going, that now 2016 we're at the point where it's a very sort of, the Indonesian middle class is now starting to catch people's attention. So it is a shift that people are only coming to terms with. I think, I'm not going to predict what politicians are going to do, because frankly it's impossible to do in an Australian context. But the idea that Australians sort of being, sensing that shift in the economy would be a sensible move, rather than keeping up old habits which were clearly from another era and are no longer pertinent. But as I say, I'm not going to try and predict who the government will be, let alone what they're going to do.
Probably just like a bit of a general one, stepping back a little bit from your research, or stepping maybe forward after your research that you've all conducted. Because we're talking about experiences and attitudes and things, and I was just curious, from your collective research, your experience, and your just general expertise in this sort of area, what can or needs to be done to sort of improve perceptions on both sides, and what can be done either as a soft power people-to-people thing, or a government-to-government, or business-to-business, or some other dweeby done by field sort of approach. What should be done, in your opinion, and based on your research, hopefully?
That's a question for young Australian person.
Yeah.
Do
you have some really good ideas in your paper?
Thank you.
No, this harks back to a couple of things that have already been said, and what we were pointing to is cultural objects, but things that are meaningful to your generation, and ultimately you finding out what those things are. But I also think that and to me this is rather critically important as somebody who's lived in Indonesia for 3 years, but also been studying Indonesia on this side for a couple of years. I think that your generation needs a bit of critical distance to try to look at what might be interesting to people who aren't interested in Indonesia. I think there's a segment of the Australian population which is quite passionate about Indonesia, and I really, really appreciate that as somebody who likes Indonesia too. But you have to think it's all about Machiavellian intelligence. I mean, if you want to be blunt in thinking about that entry point to Indonesia, I think that sometimes to a younger generation, for instance, Indonesian traditional arts will be a hard sell. So the question is, where's that common ground? Where can we find that common ground? Because I think to a certain degree, that common ground isn't going to be found necessarily at the forefront of people that are really passionate about Indonesia without a bit of self-reflection, but also that common ground, with all due respect to the people who fund these things and are actually doing good work in the diplomatic circle, that common ground isn't going to be found within the golden ghettos of Jakarta. It's going to be somewhere between those 2 points.
There was just one thing to add. The most sort of in-depth ideas and polling that do ask, what, or tries to correlate with what people know, what people think, finds that travel and tourism is often one of those entry points. So the fact that so many Australians go to Indonesia, even in just Bali, has been seen to correlate with knowledge, and knowledge has been seen to correlate with positive relations. So I'm not sure about the effectiveness of that. That's not my area of expertise, but that has been suggested as the sort of the easiest sell, but also something that actually does have effect. And in my previous work, where I've looked at how travel to Asia has affected Australians' ideas about Asia, not Indonesia, but that broader category of Asia in the long term, that personal experience and the sort of level of knowing Asia on a different non-political level has been quite effective. It takes away that threat perception and it creates a sort of personal bond which sidesteps fear.
Just quickly, and this goes back to the other question. Some of our participants, Indonesian participants, were saying that other than when Australia features in the political news, they don't see much more of Australia on TV. And so they don't get that, understanding of what is Australia, other than, they don't even know Hugh Jackman's Australian. So things like that, they don't see things like that. So it's that aspect, I guess, too.
Yeah. I mean, this is fantastic discussion, because I can let you know that, as Richard flagged, the Australia-Indonesian Centre with EY Sweeney have done this very significant survey plus focus group research of Australians and of Indonesians about each other. And that kind of research is going to drilled down to help answer some of these questions and to try and shed some light. So that's going to be a really exciting new data set that we can have a look at and you can use and mine, and that hopefully, in the not too distant future, in the next few months, and we're really excited about that. I'm also excited about an initiative that we're doing at the Australia-Indonesia Centre, which is bang on with let's have some cultural exchange here. Let's see, let's share stories. Yeah, okay. So you might have seen it. We've got a short film competition and a festival that's going to follow from that, which is for Australian and Indonesian filmmakers. The idea being that, yeah, exactly, we just kind of show each other a little slice of life, from student film to hopefully some really fabulous, professional kinds of productions, and then we will screen these films together in various places around Indonesia and around Australia. It's just a kind of, a first touch of getting those stories around some cultural objects. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much.